Misri to visit Beijing as India. China look to revive dialogue. Foreign Secretary will meet Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Sun Weidong and discuss resumption of direct flights between two countries, visas and Mansarovar Yatra. Direct flight between two countries, visas and Mansarovar Yatra. Trade issues and concerns over hydropower project may also come up. Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri will travel to Beijing on Sunday in another indication that India and China are reviving all dialogue mechanisms after the 4 year break over the military standoff at the line of actual control. The meeting follows October 21 agreement to end the stalemate at the LAC, which was ratified by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping during a summit in Russia, followed by meetings between foreign ministers and defense ministers of the two countries. Mr. Misri, who served as Indian ambassador to Beijing 2019-21 and Deputy National Security Advisor 21-24, will meet Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Sun Weidong, who was his counterpart as Chinese ambassador to India 2019-22. Among issues expected to be discussed are the resumption of direct flights between India and China, which remain suspended since the pandemic, issuance of visas, particularly for business persons and journalists, ironing out trade issues, and arrangements for the resumption of Mansarovar Yatra. Among issues expected to be discussed are resumption of direct flights between India and China, which remain suspended since the pandemic, issuance of visas, particularly for business persons and journalists, and ironing out of trade issues and arrangements for the resumption of Mansarovar Yatra for pilgrims. The resumption of this bilateral mechanism flows from an agreement at the leadership level to discuss next steps for India and China relations, including in the political, economic, and people to people domains. The External Affairs Ministry said in a statement indicating that the talks are part of revival of a regular dialogue. That the talks are a part of a revival of a regular dialogue. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not commented on this visit thus far. On Tuesday, the ministry spokesperson had said that the India and China must deliver on the understandings reached between Xi and Modi. Mr. Misri will be in Beijing on Jan 26 and 27. He will leave after the Republic Day parade in New Delhi. The Foreign Secretary's visit comes just before the Chinese New Year holidays that begins on Jan 28. Chinese ambassador to India Zhou Fihang is already in Beijing, underst- understood to be in preparation for the visit. At a reception for the New Year in Delhi this week, Chinese Charge Affairs Wang Lai said India and China would hold dozens of celebratory events to mark the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and India. He said that India China economic exchanges had grown 2% in the past year, with trade figures reaching $126.6 billion in the first 11 months of 2024 and 280,000 visas being issued by China during this year. Considerable tensions. However, the two sides also faced considerable tensions over economic and visa issues, with recent reports suggesting that Chinese manufacturers were withholding technology and exports to India, including the tunnel boring manufacturer in China, tunnel boring machines manufactured in China and Germany, including the Chinese manufacturers were withholding technology and exports to India, including the tunnel boring machines manufactured in China and Germany. Despite a declaration after the meeting between Mr. Jaishankar and Mr. Wang in November 24 over resumption of flights, the Mansarovar Yatra, for pilgrims, there has been little movement on the ground on these issues thus far. In addition, Chinese hydropower project on the upper riparian area of Brahmaputra Yarlung Zangpo in Tibet has caused concern about the flooding downstream. We must convey that any reset in these ties would require a lot of hard work because accumulated anxieties remain both on broader issues as well as economic issues. The multi-billion dollar deal for six advanced conventional submarines under Project 75I has crossed a major milestone with the bid by Mazgaon Dock Shipbuilders Limited, Mumbai, and Germany's TKMS having cleared the technical evaluation conducted by Defense Ministry. The bid by Larsen and Toubro along with Navantia of Spain has not cleared the evaluation. The benchmark price of 43,000 crore for the deal was set a decade ago, and given the technological upgrades since and factoring the inflation and currency fluctuations, the final cost is expected to see a major upward revision. MDL confirms that the commercial bid submitted by MDL has been opened by the Ministry of Defense. Further processing. The compliance checks of the two bids received were completed last year in June as the field evaluation trials and the reports were since under scrutiny in the ministry. The bids were opened last week and the bid by MDL TKMS was declared technically compliant according to the official sources. The commercial negotiations will now commence based on the price quoted in the bid. Indian Navy's Sarvekshak INS Sarvekshak completed the first phase of hydrographic survey of Mauritius covering an extensive area of 25,000 square miles. President of Indonesia arrives for the Republic Day feat to meet Prime Minister tomorrow. Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto, this is the first state visit of Mr. Subianto. He is the fourth Indonesian president to be the chief guest of the Republic Day. As a special gesture, a 352-member marching and band contingent from Indonesia will take part in the parade. India was the first major country to recognize Indonesia. In New Delhi, led an international campaign for recognition of Indonesia's independence at the international level in 1940s. Over the past decade, Indonesia has emerged as an important pillar of India's Act East policy, and regular interactions have been held between officials and military personnel of both sides. Indonesia is one of the largest trading partners in India in the Asian region, with bilateral trade touching $29.4 billion in 2023-24. Mr. Modi visited Indonesia in 2018 when the relation was elevated to the level of comprehensive strategic partnership and two sides adopted a shared vision of India-Indonesia maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. India is home to one of the oldest Indian diaspora communities in the Asian region, and the two sides are ancient cultural partners. Meta secures NCLAT relief from CCI's WhatsApp diktat. Meta has challenged the CCI directive issued in November that imposed a ban on data sharing between WhatsApp and other Meta entities for advertising purposes. Ban on data sharing between WhatsApp and other Meta entities for warning it may have to roll back some features. Meta also criticized the CCI for not having the technical expertise to understand the ramification of its order. On Thursday, India's National Company Appellate Law Tribunal ordered a suspension of data sharing ban while it continues to hear Meta's challenge to antitrust ruling. The ban may lead to a collapse of WhatsApp business model. The tribunal noted India is the biggest market for Meta, where it has more than 350 million Facebook users and over 500 million people using WhatsApp. Facebook's registered entity engaged in selling advertising. Facebook India and services reported revenue of $315.1 million in 23-24, the highest in at least 5 years. Putin is increasingly concerned about status of Russia's economy. President Vladimir Putin has grown increasingly concerned about distortion in Russia's wartime economy, just as Donald Trump pushes for an end to Ukraine conflict. The sources with knowledge of the situation have said. The Russia's economy, driven by exports of oil, gas, and minerals, Russia's economy, driven by exports of oil, gas, and minerals, grew robustly over the past 2 years despite multiple rounds of Western sanctions imposed after its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But domestic activity has become strained in recent months by labor shortages and high interest rates introduced to tackle inflation. That has contributed to the view within a section of the Russian elite that negotiated settlement to the war is desirable, according to the two of the sources familiar with the thinking in Kremlin. Russia, of course, is economically interested in negotiating a diplomatic end to the conflict. Make interest-free capex loans to states conditional. Make interest-free capex loans to industrial. Make interest-free capital expenditure loans to states conditional. Make interest-free capital expenditure loans to states conditional. Second is change dividend income tax policy and commit lowering simplifying indirect taxes. Change dividend income tax policy, dividend income tax policy, dividend income tax policy. Based on central government's gross taxes data, direct taxes account for around 57% of the taxes now, highest share in 15 years. Focus on boosting household income, not consumption, and the government should accept its limitation in incentivizing government corporate investments. The first full year budget of the new government comes against the backdrop of slower domestic economic growth, weakening currency, and a highly uncertain global geopolitical situation, especially the Trump led US administration. Not surprisingly, then, the expectations are running high, below our my 5 expectations from the union budget, making interest free capex loans to states conditional. One of the most worrying trends in the public finances in the recent past has been the increasing number of welfare schemes. The union government announced the PM Kisan scheme in the interim budget 2019, which was followed by the free food grains to about 81.35 crore citizens in December 22 for 1 year and was extended to 5 years in November 23. Notwithstanding the prospering India, several states have announced unconditional monthly stipends to various groups women, students, unemployed, etc., without any economic criteria or statistical reasoning. This followed farm loan waivers announced by several states post 2019. All these trends are a bit confusing because if states have the resources to announce cash transfers to other welfare schemes, then the need for interest-free loans to capex to states by the central government must be reviewed. It would be useful to link such capex loans with some conditions, such as the achievement of capex by each state versus its budget estimate and the ratio of welfare schemes cash transfer current expenditure to current expenditure of each state. The higher the former and the lower the latter, the more the state deserve capex support from the central government. Such conditions would help bring some fiscal discipline among states, and the center needs to start by setting an example, change dividend income tax policy, and commit to lowering simplifying indirect taxes. There is no doubt that personal income tax rates are high, but the burden of direct taxes is more widespread and concerning. Based on the central government's gross taxes data, Direct taxes, personal and corporate income taxes account for around 57% of the total taxes now, highest share in 15 years. Nevertheless, if we do if we include states tax, the indirect taxes still account for around 60% of the tax receipts in the country. The same as it was a decade ago. A couple of recommendations on this front are: double taxation on dividend income must be abolished by either making it tax deductible for companies or by reverting the old system of including it in only the corporate income taxes. Government needs to articulate by intention of making GST simpler by reducing tax slabs and interventions and lowering the burden of indirect taxes. Focus on boosting household income, not consumption. It is widely believed that urban consumption growth has slowed down while rural economy has improved in FY25. There is thus a lot of expectation from the government to boost consumption. This is unwarranted. The government needs to focus on improving household income growth rather than consumption. Apart from simplifying and lowering indirect taxes, any support to construction sector, the highest employer industry in India, would be highly effective and may help pull workers away from the agriculture sector. Further, while formalization of economy is beneficial, it is not as advisable to completely overlook the huge informal sector MSMEs. Therefore, any non-inflationary support to the micro and small enterprises would be welcome. Remain on the path of fiscal consolidation and focus on the capex. It is very likely now that the government will miss its FY25 capex target by around about 11 lakh crore. Further, the first batch of supplementary demands for grants for FY25 included proposals involving a net cash outgo of 44,000 crore. Total spending thus is anticipated to be lower than the target this year, even though total receipts could meet the budget estimates. Therefore, the central government will probably overachieve its fiscal deficit target this year. We recommend that governments continue on the path of consolidation and target a deficit of 4.5% of GDP next year with a clear preference for capex. It would mean that total spending growth may remain subdued at around 7%. Year on year growth the same as FY25. A further decline in the total spending to GDP ratio, 6-year low of 14% implies the fiscal impulse may remain negative in FY26 as well. Still, the center's capex could grow 10 to 15% in FY26, following a plus minus 5% change this year. At the same time, if the government chooses to target debt to GDP ratio from the subsequent years, it needs to clearly outline its target range over a longer period. The government should accept its limitation in incentivizing corporate investment. Finally, the government needs to recognize its limitation in pushing private corporate investments higher. During the past 5 years, government capex has recorded a CAGR of 16%, household investments have risen for 12%, and corporate investments by only 6%. Excluding CPSEs, private corporate capex grew 8% during the past 5 years. This is despite steep reduction in corporate income tax and in September 2019, although it may be appealing to attribute the lack of increased spending to companies. We must acknowledge that their spending decisions are primarily driven by project viability and available profit opportunities. The government needs to accept that the rising prominence of equity markets, globalization, and independent management have diminished the policymakers' ability to influence corporate investments. The government needs to accept that the government needs to accept A rising prominence of equity markets, globalization, and independent management have diminished the policymakers' ability to influence corporate investments. It is worth analyzing if India's corporate investments can rise from the current levels without compromising sustainability, rather than announcing further incentives to push corporate investments. Overall, the government needs to seize the opportunity presented by Union Budget 25-26 to articulate its long term economic vision rather than getting distracted by short term trends. Dumping past the tariff cost to the consumer, China set up plant in the US. A tariff is a tax that a government imposes on goods imported into the country in question. A tariff is a tax that government imposes on goods imported into the country in question. Product X Product X, say a car manufactured in the US is sold in the country for $120 and a similar car imported from China is sold at $100. Over time, as more American customers buy the cheaper car, imports from China rise and consequence as sales of American car maker decline, wages of its workers do not rise enough and some of it start to get laid off. The company stops hiring and also stops expanding, so no new jobs are created. The US trade deficit, the difference between the value of imports and exports, increases. This essentially means more money flows out of the country. This essentially means more money flows out of the country. American consumers continue to get cheaper cars. The US government then imposes a protectionist tariff of 50% on all car imports from China. Why would the US government want to impose tariffs? Due to one or more reasons. One or more of these reasons: protect the domestic car industry. Chinese car will now cost $150 instead of $100. Protect the domestic car industry. Chinese cars will now cost $150 instead of $100, and demand will arguably shift to the cheaper one, US made cars. The whole industry would be better off financially. Raise tax revenues. Taxing a product that is selling well brings government revenue. If the sole purpose is to raise revenue, the tariff rate may not be 50% but only 5 to 10% so that sale of Chinese cars don't completely dry up. Force Chinese companies to build their cars in the US. This is called the foreign direct investment, and it is a good way to ensure that American consumers get better or cheaper cars and American workers don't lose their jobs either. How might a country how might a country that is targeted by tariffs respond? Dumping. The Chinese car makers, if they have the resources, can choose to simply absorb the tariff and continue to sell for $100. The calculation would be to drive American car makers out of the market over time, and once they have a monopoly, raise prices and recover previous losses. The Chinese car makers, if they have the resources, can choose to simply absorb the tariff and continue to sell for $100. The calculation would be to drive American car makers out of the market over time and have once they have a monopoly, raise prices and recover previous losses. Pass the tariff cost to the consumer. Chinese firms can add 50% tariff to the price of the car, so it is the American buyer who ends up paying the tariff. There will be inflation in the US while China will remain largely unaffected. In such cases, American car makers raise the prices from $120 to $140 and make more money without necessarily improving the quality of the car and efficiency of manufacturing it. The US government also earns more revenues in this case, but American consumers still bear the cost. China plans to set up a plant in the US. This is essentially what Trump wants. China may not do so, may not want to do so given the higher labor and input cost in the US. It may not be able to build that car for $100 and setting factory in the US rather than China would imply Chinese job losses. Trade rerouting. China may reroute their cars through countries such as Mexico and Canada that enjoys a free trade agreement with the US. So China exports as much as fully built car to Mexico, where it is repackaged and sold as a Mexican export to the US. Trade war. China may retaliate by counter tariffs on goods that it imports from the US, say corn or aircraft, once or it can devalue its currency in such a way that the net effect of the US tariffs is zero. The exchange rate of Chinese renminbi is not fully determined by market forces. The response of any country to tariffs is usually a mix of these strategies, but it is important to note that tariffs, while attempting to favor domestic producers and government finances, also always hurt domestic consumers. Large scale disruptions of trade can raise prices and inflation, and may fail to achieve the original goals of the protecting domestic industry. Even when domestic industry is protected, the cost in terms of being saddled with substandard and costlier cars as Indians were before economic reforms of 91 is borne by the domestic consumer. Did the tariffs imposed by Trump against China in its first term work? It depends upon the parameter one looks at. If it just the US-China direct trade is considered, Trump's tariffs worked very well between 2017, the year before the first Trump administration put 25% tariffs on Chinese goods, and 23 imports from China fell, and overall trade balance, in this case deficit represented a minus sign reduced. But the picture on US trade with Mexico and Canada is different. In both cases, both US imports and trade deficits ballooned. Ajay Srivastava has pointed out that while US imports from China has declined from $81 billion, overall US trade deficit across all trading partners widened as imports shifted to non-Chinese sources. China showcased remarkable resilience, increasing its global exports by $1.1 trillion dollars and cementing its role as a critical player in global supply chains of electronics, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy. Contrast to the US trade deficit, which increased 516 billion to 784 billion in 2023. According to Srivastav's study, the key beneficiaries of the trade war between US and China were Mexico, Canada, Asian nations, which together accounted for 57% of growth in the US imports. The question for India: are Indian exporters ready and capable of using opportunity if the new trade war begins, or could India become a market that passes through the Chinese goods to the US without much value addition at the domestic level? So that's all. See you in the next one.